May 8, 2014, Vermont Governor Peter Shumlin signed off on a law which would require GMOs to be labeled in Vermont.
And I'm really proud to be the only governor in the country who signed a bill that says the consumers have the right to know what's in their food. And in Vermont, if you're going to buy food in this state, we feel that you should have among the labeling that says the ingredients, how much fat there is, how much sugar there is, all the other things that are required. You should be required to also say, does it or does it not include GMO-grown products?
On Friday, July 24, 2015, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 1599, aka the Dark Act, which would prevent states from being allowed the right to require that GMOs be labeled. This new bill would allow for voluntary GMO labeling. Voluntary labeling has been there since day one, and guess what? The food manufacturers haven't done it. If they were planning on labeling GMOs, they would have done it already, and they wouldn't be fighting this bill. But what are GMOs? To give us a breakdown, I went to one of the top sources of the matter.
Genetically modified organisms are organisms that have been created through a process where DNA is combined between multiple different species. So typically that involves mixing together bacteria, virus, and plant genes, and it can even involve animal genes. So in this process of genetic engineering, organisms are created that could never happen in nature or through traditional breeding. It's a very experimental and unstable process, and a lot is still unknown about the long-term effects for human health and the environment.
Sponsor of the bill, Representative Mike Pompeo, stated, "Precisely 0 pieces of credible evidence have been presented that foods produced with biotechnology pose any risk to our health and safety."
The public was not getting a clear picture of what the issues really were. There's a lot of science that's not been reported to the public because it doesn't support the mainstream view that genetically modified organisms is safe beyond any reasonable doubt. When you put a new gene in, it can affect the other genes in the system. That means that if there's very small toxins in a food which is not harmful, it could uplift those toxins and make them more dangerous.
As a 2010 article by Environmental Sciences Europe shows, data appear to indicate liver and kidney problems as endpoint of GMO diet. And a landmark study at the University of Sherbrooke Hospital Centre in Quebec, Canada, found 93% of blood samples taken from pregnant women and 80% from umbilical cords tested positive for traces of the Bt toxins found in GM seeds. Another issue with GMOs is the use of glyphosate, the key ingredient of Roundup, which is absorbed into the plants and passed on to us through the food produced from them. In fact, a Huffington Post article from June of 2015 stated, 17 experts from 11 countries meeting at the World Health Organization International Agency for Research on Cancer unanimously agreed to reclassify glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans. Monsanto has called the IRC findings junk science, as the findings differ from the assessment of regulatory agencies in the US. Are these the same agencies which called DDT and Agent Orange safe? Or maybe the ones which called cigarettes and asbestos harmless? The IARC, unlike the regulatory agencies, look at all the available studies and does not ignore or downplay studies which do not follow narrow testing protocols. Maybe what Mike should say is, 0 studies sponsored by Monsanto presented that foods produced with biotechnology pose any risk to our health and safety. Food labeling is already required for most prepared foods already. So for instance, if food were to contain olive oil instead of sunflower oil, it'd be labeled as such because they're 2 different ingredients. And since GMOs are different than their non-GMO counterparts, so much so that the US Patent Office has issued patents to the makers of them, they should already have been labeled, wouldn't you say?
It's a consumer's right to know whether you like GMOs or don't like GMOs or think they're good or think they're horrible. Consumers have a right to know what's in their food. There's over 64 countries that have labeling. It's crazy that the US doesn't.
As Pompeo would also state, we should not raise prices on consumers based on the wishes of a handful of activists. In a recent study posted by ABC News, 93% of Americans think GMOs should be labeled. Does this sound like a handful of activists to you? Or a vast majority of the population? To me, it sounds like the handful of pro-GMO activists are the one costing us money. After all, if they would just label these products that they're so proud of, this would all end. But as we all know, that would cost way too much, because companies never, ever change their labeling. So the next time you change your labels for marketing purposes, just add may contain GE ingredients. Simple as that. 275 out of 425 representatives voted in favor of this bill. With 93% of Americans thinking GMOs should be labeled, it doesn't sound to me like the House of Representatives we're actually representing. No, let me rephrase that. Those 275 representatives were representing. They were representing the corporations, and once again ignoring the voice of the people.